We have a panel here to go into some basic concepts of presidential power. What I'd like us to look at and have you think about are some of the theories of presidential power that have come on and are very much in the forefront today. One that concerns me a lot, as I mentioned last time, inherent power. Some people think inherent power is a synonym for implied power. If it is, then we don't need it. Just say implied power. At least with implied power, you have to say there's an expressed power, and from that could be derived as an implied power. This power, such as if the president is to see that the laws are faithfully executed and some cabinet head is preventing him from seeing that the laws are faithfully executed, he has an implied power to remove that person. That's an implied power. You have to argue, you have to reason. Inherent power, as I indicated earlier, is something I find very disturbing because there's no particular way to define it or cabin it, and if you can't define it and cabin it, then you're losing what is the Constitution, which is it's a way to distribute power and to see that power is not abused. So inherent power, see if we can be interested in some of the panelists, if we can get a handle around that. And the other one, it's not a new model, the Unitary Executive model. It got a lot of play in the Reagan years. It's back again big. And it's the theory that everything in the executive branch is totally under the control and supervision of the president. And everything that Congress has done since 1789 that interferes with that supervision is unconstitutional. So that if the Congress creates, as it did with ICC, other independent commissions, all those are unconstitutional because they interfere with the president's control over the executive branch. And you know, there's something, responsibility in the president is a very, very important constitutional value. There's reasons why we have one president. On the other hand, to argue for unitary executive, you would even have to allow the president to intervene whenever an administrative law judge handles something, even within a department, within an executive department. You have to have the president go in and countermand and change and interfere with the administrative law judge, any judicial function. And I'll make one comment on this and then I'll turn it to the panelists because we want to hear more from them, is that this issue did come up in 1789 and it came up with the Treasury Department. And consistent with one president, they decided for the War Department and the State Department and for the Treasury that there would be one secretary for accountability and unity. And when they were debating the Treasury Department bill, there was this office of the comptroller. And Madison, who would be a strong proponent for presidential removal power, said in this case the comptroller is a quasi-judicial officer and must have independence from the president because he will be making judgments about the legality of expenditures. So already in 1789 you have this concept that there are certain officers inside the executive branch who are not subject to presidential control. They do have independence, they do have autonomy. You have, in recent years, Steve Calabrese and many other scholars have written very long articles on the Unitary Executive. And you know, these are good people with good skills and digging into history. And I have to say on those articles I read on the Unitary Executive, every time they run into anything that's inconsistent with their model, it's just not treated. It's not even confronted, it's not analyzed, it's just not there. So those are two concepts that are of interest to me in terms of presidential power today. Inherent power, unitary executive. There are some other things mentioned here. A large standing army, leadership of political party. And I think that's about it. How do these new theories today can be reconciled with the principles established and believed in by the Founding Fathers? So I think since Rick and I have already talked a little bit, I'm going to skip over. I'll go to Dan Hoffman go first, Don Robinson goes second, back to Rick, and I'll just stand here and listen. So Dan, why don't you start off?
Get the man a chair, gracious.
No, I like standing. I'm like Don Rumsfeld, I stand up.
You're a stand-up guy.
Well, there's been quite a bit of talk suggesting that we're facing unprecedented problems, and in my view, these issues go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic. In fact, I think they go back further than that. Charles I thought he was above the law, and he lost his head for it. You might have thought that would have solved the problem, but here we are again, and Richard Nixon said if the president does it, it's not illegal, and they got rid of him, and here we are again. The Constitution spelled out to a certain degree the powers of Congress and the president and the courts, and it very rapidly appeared that a lot of things had been left to the imagination. And I think the founders thought of themselves as a small, relatively cohesive elite who would be able to work things out by informal agreement, by legislation, or what have you. George Washington went to the Senate, a group of a couple dozen people, and sat down to get their advice and consent on a treaty with Indian tribes. And he was so disturbed by their disrespectfulness and raucousness and inability to agree with each other that he said he was damned if he'd ever go back there again. And so issues about how the branches communicate developed right away. Question came up, should the House of Representatives have a gallery? Should they have public debates? And should the press be allowed to record them? There's nothing about that in the Constitution. Some of these things have been resolved in ways that we now take for granted, and there are others that we're still arguing about. In 1793, a war broke out between England and France. We had a treaty with France. The president did not convene Congress. The Constitution said he may. It didn't say he shall. Instead, he proclaimed our neutrality, in effect abrogating the treaty with France. And there was a debate in the newspapers between Hamilton and Madison about this. The end result was that Congress passed a neutrality law, retroactively validating what had been done. In 1795, a secretly negotiated treaty was ratified by the Senate, signed by the president. The president asked Congress for funds. Congress wanted to see the documents about the negotiations. They already had the text of the treaty itself. The president said, no, you can't have them. The House protested the refusal of the documents, but felt obligated to vote the funds anyway, given the international situation as well as the domestic situation. And just 2 years after that, we have the sedition law being passed, which says not only can you not make us do what you want us to do, you being either Congress or a majority of the public, it also says anybody who says nasty things about us is subject to being put in prison, including members of Congress. Well, these problems seem to go away for a long time in the 19th century because you don't have the kind of international crises which tend to produce the maximum in presidential backbone. But nowadays we're in this sort of permanent crisis situation, and the attempts to restrain it and oversee it have been relatively disappointing. The framers did not intend to establish a monarchy, but they were surprised by a lot of things, as I said, very early on. Imperialism doesn't start in 1898. Certainly the War of 1812 was an excellent demonstration of the aspirations for empire, and they did use the word without any embarrassment. And I don't think they foresaw the kinds of strains that expansion and warfare would put on the structures of government that they had established. They did not anticipate fully the question of who sets the agenda for our government. I think the structure of the Constitution and the language of Article 1 makes it pretty clear what their understanding was. Congress would make basic policy decisions. The President would then carry those out and fill in the blanks to the extent necessary. But I think even from the beginning, Congress had difficulty setting an agenda because of its diversity of membership and because of the way it's organized. And these days, a House of Representatives of 435 is not an ideal-sized body for agenda setting. The President, very early, with Madison's help, started to take this role and put Congress in the position of responding to that and going second. Not only may the House be too large for the kind of agenda leadership the founders contemplated, I think today it's way too small for effective oversight of an executive branch of millions of people. And so there's a profound question about what kind of reform would actually redress the balance and produce a more effective set of checks. I don't know, I don't think there are any realistic prospects for amending the Constitution at all these days, unless you count some of the conservatives' key projects as conceivable possibilities. But perhaps making it easier to remove a president, and I guess you'd also have to change the line of succession, because putting Hastert in there isn't going to change a thing as far as I can see. That might be one way to go after it. Perhaps making members of Congress ineligible to run for president would at least solve the problem of people in Congress supporting a strong presidency because they hope to have the job themselves someday. You could try to write something like a more effective version of the War Powers Act into the Constitution. Maybe we could even have a Bill of Rights. That might be good.
Don, just bringing up the Neutrality Proclamation is another example of how individual citizens can get involved, because you had a proclamation and people who violated the proclamation were prosecuted, and ordinary jurors, they could be a baker or anybody out there, says, so what's this you're doing? You're prosecuting someone for a criminal offense that comes out of a presidential proclamation? What? I think you need a statute for that. We're going to acquit anyone you bring in here until you get yourself a statute. So nice feedback from a jury level to a president, and that's when Washington went to get a statute. Don.
Thank you, Lou. I'm very happy to be here this morning. I'm not able to be here long, sadly, owing to an illness that my wife is suffering, and I must return to her soon. But I am glad to be here as long as I can be here with so many old friends who have been arguing these matters and struggling to be heard over the din of politics. I'm very grateful to those who organized this conference on the constitutional predicament that we are in. Stuck as we are, or having, at any rate, an 18th century constitution in a 21st century world. That's really the problem we have, and it's not a simple one, because not only is the Constitution venerated, at least in theory, but it has proven resilient in ways which I will spend a moment developing. It's worth noting that the title of this conference, or title of this panel, which is that the powers and responsibilities of the president were not envisioned, not planned for by the framers of the Constitution. That is an early traditional argument. It suggests that changes in executive power, abuses, if you will, of executive power, derive from the changed circumstances of modernity. That is not the argument that we are dealing with right now from this administration. John Yoo and Robert Turner and others have made the argument that that in fact the framers did intend exactly what is happening now. They anticipated the circumstances that we are in, war and so on, and domestic challenges and insurrection and all the rest of it, and they therefore gave the executive plenary powers. This is an argument which we will have spelled out in some detail by the world's leading expert on Curtis Wright case, David Adler, who is with us and who will be addressing those matters later in the conference. It is an argument that the executive has by nature plenary powers, and that the terms of the Constitution restrict those powers in certain areas. In other words, the president has the power to make executive agreements, but if those executive agreements take the form of a treaty, they require 2/3 of the Senate. These are ways in which this Constitution has developed, and the point is that George Sutherland, in the Curtis Wright case, made the argument, made an early form of the argument, I think, that John Yoo has now become famous for, and which Power is so eager to promote and encourage. I'm not going to spend much time on John Yoo's argument. I regard it as bizarre and profoundly mistaken for reasons that I think most people in this room understand, certainly as well as I, and probably some of you a lot better. What I would like to do is to address the theme of this particular panel, which is to re-examine the framers' intent in light of modernity. That is, what about our present circumstances have created dilemmas and problems for the framers' Constitution, the 18th century Constitution. Again, much of this is well known, and I will not dwell on it. For example, the standing army argument. Let me step back one step here and suggest to you that the framers' design for checks and balances and limited power held for 150 years, with a couple of exceptions, most spectacularly Mr. Lincoln during the Civil War, but in general held for two reasons. One, we had no standing army in peacetime. That is, the military was demobilized following wars. There is a graph in a book that I wrote one time which shows that. I mean, the armies fall off right after the peak of the mobilization. And the other factor that made that framework hold for 150 years is that we had a doctrine of no entangling alliances, and it was firmly held by the American people. In other words, there was a cultural support for the notion that we were not going to get involved in complicated international situations. Those two things are gone. One, we have a standing army now. We have no fewer than 1.5 or 2 million men and women in arms now. And way beyond that, we have rockets that deliver weaponry practically instantaneously. And we have nuclear weapons which are able to rain a degree of devastation on others, and by the way, on ourselves, should it come to that, at a level unimagined by the framers. So that whole standing army thing is now turned on its head and made a very dangerous situation. As far as no entangling alliances are concerned, in the period following the Second World War, we gave that up. We entered into a series of alliances with North Atlantic countries, with Southeast Asian countries, and so on, Latin American countries in new forms, and so on. And so that we now have not only these treaties, but a cultural disposition that supports them. That is, there is a notion that we have responsibilities around the world. And this is very powerful, so powerful that George Bush II, who campaigned on a notion against nation building, in fact finds himself building nations. I mean, it is as if there is something ineluctable, something irresistible about our compulsion to control an empire in the world. And a sense of responsibility about it. And we shouldn't be cynical about this, because it is part of what's leading us to try to take some responsibility for what's going on in Darfur. and such idealistic crusades as that. I mean, we're not doing very well with it, but there is a notion that we are responsible to some extent for things going on around the world. And that's inescapable. There's no point in pretending that we can go back to a world of no entangling alliances or no imperial responsibilities. If we could, that would be a major step back toward the framers' design, but we're not going to do that. Now, the other things that have changed are listed in the brief paragraph that set up this, this dialogue this morning, this panel. One of them, you'll remember, had to do with political parties, and the other had to do with media attention, the president's monopoly of media attention. Now, political parties are an important part of the president's power. The president is the leader of his party, as we all know. It's one of the hats he wears and so on. We've all taught that a long time. And it is a fact that the president has those powers. In the exercise of those powers, however, the presidents are trying to do what James McGregor Burns used to call outwitting the framers. They're trying to outwit the framers in leading a political party. The framers set up a constitutional design to frustrate political parties. That's, as much as anything else, the purpose of the constitutional design. Presidents have come to exercise those powers, to take them on, and have enormous frustration in doing so. So I think if we were to thoroughly analyze the difference political parties have made, it has given the president a lot of power. It's also given the president a lot of responsibility that he cannot effectively meet in some ways. I refer you back to what I regard as a great classic of the presidency, Jeffrey Toulis's book, The Rhetorical Presidency, which presents a wonderful argument about the two-edged sword of party leadership and rhetoric that presidents wield. They still run into that Constitution that the framers left behind. The other question is media attention. The president does control access to the media to a degree which we have seen exercised most remarkably in the last 6 years. But notice that lately, presidents have really lost control of that. Again, it's not something upon which presidents can count, and it becomes, under many circumstances, a two-edged sword. The other factor that has changed as a consequence of the 200 years of our experience is the powers of Congress. We lament it, we presidential scholars and we who are concerned about the exercise of war powers and so on, the weak-kneed Congress, which has so badly handled affairs symbolized by the War Powers Resolution. Lou has outlined the view that most of us now take, the ineffectiveness of that and the kind of false promise of the War Powers Resolution. Without going into detail, we can get to that in the later discussion, if you like. But the result of all of this has been a gathering of precedents that support the exercise of presidential power to a degree, I believe, unanticipated by the framers. We have the Lincoln precedents, the Harry Truman precedents, the FDR precedents. These are towering precedents, and presidents, in appealing to them, draw enormous strength, without question. Those precedents, however, are countered by the example of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, and I believe that George W. Bush will enter into that side of the equation too, for most opinion as it unfolds. So there is this debate going on about presidential power. It's essentially a political debate, a political debate, not a constitutional debate. We who invoke constitutional principles and who believe so deeply in them have been Cassandras, trying to get attention for the disaster that lies that way. Toulis, to his credit, pointed out that even presidents will suffer if they exercise these modern powers because they're in the context of a constitution which will frustrate them, certainly in domestic policy, but increasingly in foreign policy as well. Our constitutional framework does not prevent, indeed it tempts, the abuse of presidential power. the exercise of executive secrecy in framing and defending presidential powers. It also provides for reaction, albeit ex post facto reaction. Presidents face a terrific reaction when their policies go awry, as they regularly do. And there is terrific vengeance that the polity can bring to bear upon a president whose policies go awry. Balance, I argue, will be restored if we survive these crises. We've had some pretty close calls. Balance can be restored following a terrible abuse of presidential power, but it is at great cost. And the question is whether there is any way to remedy the situation before it starts. Can we somehow build into the system a way of getting presidential power, bringing presidential power to heel before a terrible crisis befalls us? Let me add just one other point. There was a conference about 3 or 4 weeks ago at Amherst College at which one of the principal speakers, the one I heard, had a chance to hear, was Kathleen Sullivan, formerly, I guess now, dean of the university, Stanford University's law school, and a brilliant, brilliant gal. She was there talking about these matters in some detail, and she suggested that the critical factor here, the thing that we've got to think about and get a hold of, at least as political scientists, if not lawyers, is the political dimension of it, the political control. And that is going to require, she suggested, a couple of things. One, a changing of the gerrymandering of districts so that there is more responsiveness and so that the incumbent's party does not have it all built in its favor to stay in power. There has got to be a strengthening of the minority party, and that's going to require perhaps the courts to come to bear more than they have so far against gerrymandering of districts for political purposes, making them impervious to political change practically, or almost. I mean, here we are in a situation where there's terrific resistance to Bush, but a question as to whether the Democrats can take control of Congress. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. The other thing that Kathleen mentioned was to empower the minority party in Congress. That means the Republican Party when the Democrats are in power, and the Democratic Party when the Republicans are in power. And this you could do by practice and perhaps even by statute or resolution, but to require regular review of executive branch performance, building into the American system something like question time in the parliamentary system, where the executive branch would be held before the nation to account for the policies. I mean, is there some way, since the dog, says Dan, and I agree with him, having labored in these vineyards for a long time, that constitutional reform, serious constitutional reform, is unlikely, to put it mildly, structural reform. Maybe there are some way that we can build a demand for the empowerment of the minority party. I'll let it go there.
Thanks very much, Rick Waterman. Rick?
Interesting, when Madison was shortly before the Constitutional Convention, he wrote to Washington, and he noted that he had pretty clear ideas what he thought Congress should be, and had absolutely no idea what he thought the executive branch should be. And the founders really, other than talking about the veto power, obviously talking about the war power, they didn't talk a lot about what the president would do at the convention. They chose the term president because it was a fairly benign term for the office. So all of the indications are that the founders were trying to limit the power of the presidency. We talk about separation of powers, but they didn't create a separation of powers. They created a separation of powers with checks and balances, which means that in terms of the unitary executive model, that may fit with a separation of powers model, but it doesn't fit very well when you start talking about checks and balances, because the idea there is that power is blended. So if we're looking at the founders, we have to kind of look at broad intent rather than specific intent, because they didn't really tell us what a lot of the actual parts of the Constitution meant There isn't a big debate there that we can look at to determine what those powers mean. And again, that wasn't problematic for the first 100 years or so. Teddy Roosevelt came along and turned everything on its head by saying that it wasn't presidents, if you know the exact quote here, please help me with it, but essentially that it wasn't a matter of the executive doing what was written in the Constitution, but rather that the president, if it wasn't written in the Constitution, the president could do it. Which, once you turn the logic around there, is a profound change. And my argument is that it's a necessary change because if you're going on the basic argument of the founders, then the presidency would be limited. But once you turn it around and focus on it from the Teddy Roosevelt perspective, you've now opened the door for pretty much anything, because one can therefore argue that nothing is written in the Constitution with any kind of clarity. Certainly, we see things like the State of the Union address as much different than did the founders. We see it as a major agenda-setting tool today, whereas originally the founders probably saw it as some sort of reporting transparency in government kind of thing. Somebody should report on the State of the Union from time to time, not as the president is going to derive incredible influence from this. So things have changed, things have been turned on their head. And I think it's interesting we're talking here about the abuses of presidential power, and one can ask the question, what have individual presidents gotten out of this? And there is, along with the literature on the presidency, as you well know, that focuses on the fact that the presidency has become imperial and they have too much power, there is the counter-literature which argues that the presidents have too little power, they can't get anything done, they're doomed, public expectations are too high, and so, in the words of Theodore Lowy, we face a series of failed and doomed presidencies. And from that perspective, if you go back to the sort of great presidencies argument, when was the last time that we had a so-called great president in the White House? That, of course, is subjective, and I tend to see that argument as being sort of, one of those interesting arguments that ends up only telling you your biases about who you like. And interestingly, always the great presidents are the ones that bended and broke the Constitution, but expanded presidential power. But when you look at the presidents in this century, you have to go back to Franklin Roosevelt, and especially since David McCullough's book came out, Truman has improved in terms of his national reputation. But Eisenhower kind of has a reputation of being sort of a detached president. People like him more now because he didn't do a lot of abuse other than the CIA covert activities. He was seen as being more responsible, and then hopefully that won't create a problem. The thing fell out. Okay. And then from that point on, every president is seen under the lens of some sort of an issue that suggests that there's a problem. Kennedy, particularly, once we get into Johnson and Nixon with the Vietnam War and Watergate, Ford and Carter are seen as weak presidents. Ronald Reagan has Iran-Contra. George W. Bush was a one-term president. Clinton, despite the fact that he left office extremely popular president, was impeached. And now George W. Bush has questions about his veracity, questions about whether he lied to get us into a preemptive war. And we shouldn't forget that this was a preemptive war. We were, one could argue that it's in the larger war on terror, but since there's no evidence that Saddam Hussein was part of the attacks on 9/11, it's hard to make the argument that, therefore, this was not a preemptive war on the part of the Bush administration. And so, at least from kind of a historical perspective, at the same time that we're talking about presidents expanding power, it's hard to see what these individual presidents are getting out of it in terms of their historical reputation. It's hard to say that any of the presidents since Truman's time are going to be seen as being a clearly great president. Some are seen as being great in certain ways. Lyndon Johnson showed incredible courage, but that's on the domestic side. That's in terms of his leadership on civil rights. The war on poverty, so a lot of those programs didn't work, but he's seen as being a tremendous leader in terms of his ability to get legislation through Congress. We now have incredibly interesting documentation that Michael Beschloss has released in terms of the conversations that Johnson had that show that he was conflicted right from the very beginning about Vietnam and saw it as a losing proposition no matter what he did, that he did not believe at any point in time that we were going to win the war in Vietnam. And as these records come out, they suggest to us that these presidents are all flawed and that none of them are great presidents in any sense that we would want to consider them. You know, there are no Lincolns today. You know, we don't see any Lincolns on the presidential campaign trail. Everybody seems like they're smaller and diminished. And perhaps in some extent, there is, you know, you might look at this and see a paradox and say, well, gee, it seems kind of like strange that the power of the presidency is growing, but shouldn't we be seeing, you know, one giant president after another accompanying this? And yet, what we're seeing is exactly the opposite. When people talk about George W. Bush, you know, you get very biased political responses. If you're a Republican, you love him. If you're a Democrat, you hate him. But most people agree that, you know, he's not the smartest man to ever have been in the White House, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. You know, it's a paradox. And again, I think part of the job here is to try to stimulate some discussion and debate. And since we're talking about the framers' intent and where the presidency has actually ended up, is there essentially here kind of the strange relationship between the development of presidential power and the fact that we're seeing these presidents in a more and more negative light? You know, is that related? Is it because of the things that they're doing under this power that we're seeing them in a negative light? Or is it because the presidency has become so large they can't possibly inhabit it? James Buchanan was writing in the 1970s that the office was too big for anybody. I guess if you make the office bigger, then it's even going to be harder for any president to inhabit that stage. So I'll just kind of leave that there and see if anybody wants to pick that thread up.
Thanks so much. On the Beschloss tapes on Lyndon Johnson, I thought that revealed that Lyndon Johnson did what John Jay and Joseph Story were afraid of. They would go to war not for the national interest, but for personal interest or party interest. Or Lyndon Johnson worried that Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon would regard him as weak on communists. It had nothing. He was not looking for the national interest at all. It was very personal and political. So we got time for questions. Oh, we can go until 25. So we got time. Please go ahead.
Glenn Sussman, Old Dominion University. The notion of a question period, for those of us who watch C-SPAN, we see the question period in a variety of parliamentary settings. And what would it take to have a question period here to hold the executive accountable and perhaps move away from the problems that we have just been hearing about?
What it would require is a commitment to doing it. And it would not require a change in the Constitution. The problem with it is that it would require the party that controls the branch to accede to it, to agree to it, to set up a national debate over the administration. I mean, if the same party controls Congress and the presidency, it's going to be very difficult to establish question period in this country. But it is very critical to do. If somehow the precedent could be established, for example, if the Democrats take control of Congress next time, one thing to do that they might do would be to set up a question period and hope that you could thereby make it traditional to have such a question period. It would be an act of political courage to do it. I mean, it's no act of courage for the Democrats to question George Bush, but to establish it as Congress's prerogative, its right under the Constitution to do that, and indeed its duty under the Constitution, I think it would be a wonderful thing. I was drawn to it.
Yeah, I think we're moving in the opposite direction, though, because presidents are actually appearing more in stage settings. They're even doing less press conferences, and they're appearing before smaller audiences that are hand-picked and are designed really to applaud and let everybody know that they're supporting the president. So we're actually moving away from settings where presidents actually have to answer questions.
Chris?
There's nothing new about holding hearings. The questions are, can the minority party cause hearings to come about? Number two, will the hearings be closed or will they be public? And number three, if the president or anyone else declines to participate, what's the remedy for that?
Richard Rose, a great commentator on American politics from Great Britain, has said that the President of the United States has become, in effect, the taster-in-chief. He's so high up in the system, there's such a vast bureaucracy below him, that he gets to select which bureaucracy will provide which solution for which problem. And this panel is about what the framers did not anticipate or prepare for. It seems to me that the biggest piece of it is secret government. It's secret bureaucracy on a truly massive scale. When Eisenhower was leaving office, he warned us of the military-industrial complex. It wasn't just government. It was government in connection with defense contractors and others. Do we not today have, in addition to that huge bureaucracy and set of connections, also a surveillance corporate bureaucracy linked in with government, so that it's not simply NSA wiretapping, it's NSA connected to lots of corporations writing software and maintaining data banks, supplying that to the government. But these people are represented by former government officials like John Ashcroft, who's their chief lobbyist. And if that is the case, how do we get control of this corporate executive bureaucracy that is so highly secret? And how has this secrecy become so legitimated in the American political consciousness?
One fact here is, and I thought of this, Rick, earlier, that the Constitution doesn't talk about an executive branch. It talks about the executive, the president. And the whole notion of a branch here is something that's evolved over the ensuing 200 plus years. And it has led to the kinds of things that Chris was just alluding to, including a penchant for secrecy. And so we come back to the question of how can we compel accountability? We've got to compel accountability. And we're wondering whether Congress can do it, whether the courts can do it, and so on. Do we not, in this present culture, rely upon the press to do it? And that's the branch, if you will, the fourth branch or whatever, that can, if anyone can, compel accountability. Now, will the press do it? It doesn't do it very well. Just trace the line of Woodward's books. When we needed accountability most, we got at least. Now that everybody's after Bush, by George, old Bob Woodward's after him too. So it's been very disappointing, and indeed the New York Times has been late and slow and everything, and trying to show balance and everything. Poor old NPR gets buffeted about by the political currents and whatnot. But it seems to me that's what we have come to. That is, it's not a constitutional solution; it's a cultural solution, and we look to the press.
Yeah, I was just going to say the obvious, that the Constitutional Convention itself was closed and secret, and the only reason that we have Madison's notes to the convention are because he was convinced not to burn them. Apparently, at one point in time, he wanted to destroy them, and the decision that he made was that he would publish them after the last member died from the convention, which I believe was himself. Yeah, and they were published in 1840, so for the first 50 years of the country's existence, they didn't have this rich basis for discussion about what the Constitution means that we now have today, which is an irony. But
they did better implementing it than we're doing.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bob Spitzer from SUNY Cortland, and I'd like to ask a somewhat different question, although apropos of your panel discussion, which raises the very important question of the relationship between law and politics. It seems to me the current administration's model of executive power, which we're going to talk about more, I'm sure, comes from two things. One is a pre-existing theory, which predates George Bush's election in 2000 pertaining to the emasculation of the presidency as they view it, the belief that from the 1970s of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and other people that the presidency need to be revived, and the development of this unitary theory of executive power that was created in the 1980s. So that model is already in place in the Bush administration, but the other thing that happens, of course, is 9/11. And as you know, in the first 8 months of Bush's presidency, his popularity was lower than that of any other president in their first 8 months. The circumstances of his election, et cetera, there was certainly a feeling that their mandate was, they were struggling to establish and implement some kind of mandate, to exercise power in some degree. But then along comes 9/11. President Bush's popularity soars to the highest level ever recorded since the advent of modern polling, to 90%, even more than the first Bush. And now they not only have a motivation, but they clearly have a political tool that becomes central to everything that happened since 9/11. So one question I have about that for you is, had there been no 9/11, what happens to Bush's view, to the administration's unitary view of presidential power? If you subtract that from...
I mean, would there be a Cold War without communism? I mean, I think you need to have some kind of catalyst. Eventually something would come along. But once the Cold War ended, even though presidential power certainly didn't recede, I mean, Clinton is still aggressively using the military, and there still would have been abuses of presidential power, or, you know, a continual accretion of presidential power. You know, you need that stimulus to provide kind of the rationale. And if you think about communism, that was a stimulus for 50 years. Terrorism could be the next 40, 50-year stimulus.
Go ahead.
I wonder why we all expect emergencies to enhance executive power. In 1789, Congress is hardly ever there. So if an emergency arises, it has to be the president. Even if he convenes Congress on the spot, it'll take weeks before they can show up. Now we have this electronic world, but we're accustomed to this, and we expect the president not just to utter reassuring words, but to take actions even when we haven't yet figured out what the problem is or who's behind it. And I think it's partly public tolerance for this, and just a knee-jerk expectation that we have that makes that linkage seem so automatic and natural.
Or is it public enthusiasm for that, not merely tolerance?
What has changed most deeply, I think, Bob, is the culture. And it is reflected in the response to 9/11. With 9/11, everything changed, right? We face an unprecedented danger, right? Wrong. I commend to you an article, I don't know how many saw it, the piece by Francis Fukuyama in the New York Times Book Review last week. If you haven't seen it, you really ought to. It's terrific. I'm going to read one short paragraph from it. Rereading these books, the current books about the torment of secrecy, by the way, the title of it is The American Way of Secrecy, and he's concerned about precisely what Chris was talking about. Rereading these books, in the light of 9/11, the Iraq War, and the Bush administration's current efforts to extend executive power, makes one realize the extent to which our current situation is not in the least new. While the nihilistic murder of nearly 3,000 Americans on American soil was unprecedented, the fact remains that both the actual and perceived threat of the late 40s was much more acute than the one presented by Islamic terrorism today. The communists controlled a huge nation state, the Soviet Union, and conquered half of Europe. In 1949, they came to power in the most populous country in the world. The awesome destructive power of nuclear weapons was new. Experts at the time confidently predicted that many states would acquire them in short order and future wars would be nuclear. Americans lived in the shadow not of the destruction of a single city or buildings, but of the entire society, and the enemy had agents who could potentially penetrate the country's most elite institution, something that few jihadists can even aspire to today. This current emergency, I mean, that's what's happened, and what needs to be resisted is this notion that we face unprecedented dangers now. We've got to get a hold of ourselves. The professor from the University of Vermont talked about that earlier, too. We cannot allow this thing to be posed in terms of war and war powers and what that does to presidential powers.
Bob, there's a difference, right, between a real emergency and a contrived emergency. And in October 2002, when Bush was putting pressure on Congress to vote on the Iraq resolution before the election, the Democrats controlled the Senate, Tom Daschle, and he could have said, we're going to follow the model of your father, namely we're going to have the election and the vote after the election in January 1991. That was a model, and it would have been a legitimate model because Daschle could have said, which was true, you haven't given us any information that's reliable, and what we're going to authorize is for you to go to the UN and get some inspectors in to Iraq so we have some information to go on. But they folded, and that's not a cultural problem, it's a political problem of people having no understanding of their institution. And the same thing happened this last month with the Military Commissions Act. The same thing is going on in the administration. You've got to act on it now. Well, you could say, and it was said in debate, you had 5 years to figure this out. 5 years, and you can't wait until a lame duck session or January to complete action on the commission bill so that we know exactly what we're doing. But it's just folding, and that what you want to do with members of Congress who fold, who have no institutional respect for themselves, is another matter. And I don't know where we get people who will stand up for the institution and say we're not going to get bullied into passing a statute that's not well thought out.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me just say that there is a national emergency. It is dire. It does threaten our survival, and it's the deficit and the national debt, and nobody is paying any attention to it. And that's the one that some presidents should be declaring war on, but it's not sexy and nobody would follow.
Ben Kleinerman, Harvard University. My question has to some degree been anticipated by the direction the conversation has turned. Professor Fisher's historical anecdote regarding juries during after the proclamation of neutrality and the refusal to find people guilty of neutrality violations, I think indicates something important about perhaps the most important change since our founding, and that is the constitutionality, so to speak, of the average citizen. In other words, at that time, people took seriously their constitution and the requirements of it. That is the average citizen. The average member of a jury took it seriously. Now people at conferences like these take these questions very seriously, but the press, the public doesn't seem to. And I wonder if that's perhaps the most pressing and the most troubling development and what we can do about it.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, to the extent we're a democracy, and we could argue that for a long time, but to the extent we're a democracy, it does. That's why I insist that it's cultural. I think it does depend upon attitudes that people have and their determination to hold the government to account. And whereas, I mean, I'm working on a history of town meeting democracy in New England, specifically in my village, and there was no reluctance at all in this little 18th century village to hold the biggest powers. You know, it's Daniel Shea's neighborhood. They were really anxious to hold people to account, government officials, and to see how far we've strayed from that in terms of the expectations that common people have upon themselves. Chris was talking about it earlier, too. It's that's a very deep problem, and I think that's where we are ultimately is with that problem. Whether citizens can once again reclaim. I mean, Bush talks about the ownership society. I think we've got to have that toward our civil government as well.
I quite like Don Robinson's proposed remedy for presidential abuse of power and to provide greater accountability by statutorily creating a question period. And since we're talking about constitutional issues here, I think it's important to address the constitutional framework for analyzing whether or not Congress could force a president to show up for a question period. I quite agree that there's a political dimension here not to be underestimated, but you could readily understand that the administration is going to offer all kinds of separation of powers objections. So I think it would be important for us to have a brief dialogue on this point. I don't find any significant objections to Congress passing a law under the necessary and proper clause, as well as its general lawmaking power, to require the president to answer questions. Secondly, under the take care clause, the president would be required to faithfully enforce the laws. Well, the question would then be, from the administration standpoint, whether or not this is an impairment. I think if we follow the reasoning of Rehnquist under Morrison versus Olson, this in no way could be described as a significant impairment of the president's central duties. So at this conference where we're talking about the Constitution, I think it's important to understand, at least from my perspective, that there would not be reasonable constitutional objections to this statute from the administration. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
My thoughts are that it would be a terrific uphill battle constitutionally, that the notion that presidents don't answer to anybody for their power, and so on, is deeply ingrained. I think it would require a change in that for presidents to be forced. I guess I didn't necessarily think, and I wish we had Kathleen Sullivan here. She could speak to it, speak to her own notion. But my sense was that others, cabinet officers and others, Condi Rice could be called before Congress to answer for foreign policy, and whatever his name is, Paulson on debt and deficit issues and so on. You could have the cabinet officers. I must say I'm old-fashioned enough to wonder whether I can really see the president himself coming and answering to such challenges. Woodrow Wilson would have loved it, as he showed in his book, Presidential Power. But, or Constitutional Power, I guess was what he called that one. But at any rate, I don't know if others have thoughts on that or not.
Well, the president's first move will be to say he's simply immune from such a procedure, and you've got Clinton versus Jones. If he has to answer to the civil courts, why shouldn't he have to answer to Congress? I mean, the argument goes on, but the deal breaker in my mind is, I'm sorry, Senator, I just can't answer your question without disclosing classified information. And it's going to be really hard to get over that one, the way we have got things currently set up.
And presidents won't even let people on their White House staff testify. It's kind of hard to imagine that they're suddenly going to show up and allow themselves to testify.
Yeah, and that's why I say I understand the political dimension here, but if this idea is to ever get any serious hearing, there has to be an effort to educate the public on the fact that there are no reasonable grounds for objection, constitutional objections for the administration, as opposed to all of these political arguments that would be trumped up.
Well, can I say that I think what we're hitting on here is that there is no mechanism right now for accountability. The only mechanism for accountability, again, is the ballot box, and that doesn't seem to work very well. And impeachment, which...
For treason, bribery, and high crimes, in which case we get the vice president.
Yeah.
So we'll stop with that. I would like you to join me in thanking our panel. Thank you very much.